Today we'll be talking about the question muscles of the abdominal wall, fascias, and function. When you get this question, the first thing you'll have to talk about is the layers of the abdominal wall. This is very important during your dissections as well. So if you divide the layers of the abdominal wall according to the outermost layer to the innermost layer, uh, it has like 8 layers. First, we start with our skin, the outermost layer, right? It has the sensory innervation by intercostal and subcostal nerves. Secondly, under the skin, you have the subcutaneous tissue. This layer is like divided into 2 layers. First, it's the fatty layer called the campus tissue, and then the second is the scarpa's layer, which is the membranous tissue. The membranous tissue is firmly attached to the linea alba. Linea alba is basically the aponeuroses, like a fused aponeuroses area of all your flat muscles of your abdominal wall. We'll talk about this in the coming slides. Uh, so yeah, it's firmly attached to the linea alba, the scarpa layer. Then below that, you have your superficial abdominal fascia, and then comes your flat muscles. 3 flat muscles that we'll talk about. It's the external oblique, internal oblique, transversus abdominis. So, like all these 3 muscles together, they form the rectus sheath as well. The aponeuroses of these muscles, not the muscles itself, like the aponeuroses of the muscles, they form the rectus sheath. Now, in between the internal oblique and the transversus abdominis, you will find iliohypogastric and ilioinguinal nerve. You'll be able to see this mostly during dissections as well. Now, after the transversus abdominis muscle, you have the transversalis fascia, right? And after that, you have your peritoneum. And between the transversalis fascia and the peritoneum, you have the inferior epigastric vessels. The superficial epigastric vessels, as you can see, it's in the subcutaneous tissue, a layer of the subcutaneous tissue. The peritoneum itself can be divided into 2 layers, parietal and visceral. Parietal, as you know, outside, visceral, stuck to the organ, right? The peritoneum, the layer is basically made up of mesothelium, which is basically simple squamous epithelium. You'll be studying about this more in histology. And this is the first thing you'll have to talk about when it comes to this question. Now, on this, in the side, I've like attached a small box here, which shows the difference of the fascias in men and women. You can definitely read through it. Okay, now here's like a small overview of what we'll be talking about in this question. Functions of the abdominal wall. We all know it protects the abdominal viscera, the organs that are there in the abdomen, right? It assists in like forceful expiration, obviously like beyond the diaphragm. And then it also is responsible for actions like coughing, vomiting, where it's basically like an increase in intra-abdominal pressure that causes such actions, right? We can divide the abdominal wall basically into 2 portions. First is the anterolateral, and then you have the posterior part of the abdominal wall. We'll be talking about 2 things in both these portions, the muscles and the fascias. The first anterolateral portion, muscles, you have 2 types of muscles. The flat muscles, as I've already said in the previous slide, they include the external oblique, internal oblique, and transversus abdominis. And then you have your vertical muscles, which is the rectus abdominis and pyramidalis muscle, right? Uh, then we'll talk about fascias. There's the superficial fascia in the anterolateral portion of the abdominal wall. Above the umbilicus, it's just a single sheet. It's like a continuous form of connective tissue. But below the umbilicus, it has 2 layers. It is divided into 2 layers, which is basically the campus and the scarpa. Now over here, you can see a picture that talks about rectus sheath, right, which is formed by the aponeuroses of all the flat muscles. Now, above the umbilicus, above the arcuate line and below the arcuate line, the rectus sheath uh, differs, right? You will see it in the aponeuroses, right? Over here, you can see that the rectus sheath is rectus abdominis muscle that we'll be talking about later. It's enclosed in between, like the internal oblique aponeuroses, right? But below the arcuate line, you have all three aponeuroses coming like in the front, right? And then the transversus abdominis muscles, aponeuroses, in the posterior part of the rectus sheath. This diagram is very important for your final exam. Then you have the posterior portion of the abdominal wall, in which we'll talk about three muscles: the quadratus lumborum, psoas major, and psoas minor. And then the fascias that we'll talk about is the psoas fascia, which covers the psoas major muscle, and it is continuous downward into the thoracolumbar fascia. The thoracolumbar fascia is basically, it has like three layers: the anterior, middle, and posterior. And there is muscles in between them. What muscles? We'll see here. Between the anterior portion and the middle portion, you have the quadratus femoris muscle. And between the middle portion and the posterior portion of the thoracolumbar fascia, you have deep back muscles that you'll talk about in the uh, muscles of the back question. Okay, so this is another picture that I've gotten from osmosis that talks about the difference in the rectus sheath transverse section uh, above the arcuate line and below the arcuate line, and what an arcuate line is. You can definitely go through this picture. Okay, now we come to the major part of the question, which are the muscles of the abdominal wall. First, we talk about the anterolateral muscles. As I've said, there are two groups of muscles that we'll be talking about: flat muscles, and you have your vertical muscles. Flat muscles, three muscles, and all these three muscles are innervated by the thoraco-abdominal and subcostal nerves, right? The first one is your external oblique muscles. Look at the origin. Origin is from the ribs 5 to 12, and it inserts below into the iliac crust and pubic tubercle. So the direction of fibers is inferomedially, right? It goes down and medially. It's like hands in pocket. A good way to remember like these three muscles, the direction. Once you know the direction, it will be easier for you to guess the origin and insertion, right? So external oblique, hands in pocket, right? Inferomedially. Then you have your internal oblique, which goes from the inguinal ligament and iliac crust to the ribs, right? So from down to up, so superomedially. So hands in pocket, and then the second one is opposite to that, right? And then you have your transversus abdominis, which is transverse direction of fibers, right? It also originates in the inguinal ligament, costal cartilages, iliac crust, and it inserts into the xiphoid process, pubic crest, and the linea alba. And the direction of fibers is transverse. So again, how do you remember the direction of fibers? And it is hands in pocket for external oblique, opposite, internal oblique, transverse abdominis. It's in the name, transverse fibers. Using this, you can kind of get the origin and insertion in your mind, and even the function, I would say. You can see it in the pictures, like the difference in like the direction of fibers: external oblique, internal oblique, and then your transversus abdominis. External oblique, hands in pocket; internal oblique, opposite of that, transversus abdominis, transverse direction of the fibers. Now about the function, um, first external oblique. They go inferomedially, hands in pocket. So if they contract, you will see contralateral rotation of your torso, meaning when you contract the right side of your external oblique, you basically move to the opposite side. That is called contralateral. Your internal oblique, there's two things we talk about. When both your sides are being contracted, it basically compresses the abdomen, right? When one side is contracted, it does the function opposite, kind of opposite to the external oblique, right? It causes ipsilateral. That is, the right side oblique fibers are contracted. Then I move myself towards, I rotate my torso towards the right side, like the same, which is transverse fibers, and the function would be compression of the abdomen. Now we talk about the two vertical muscles. You have two muscles, rectus abdominis and then pyramidalis. Rectus abdominis, you can see in the picture, it's this huge muscle right in front, right? Which is responsible for your abs when you do crunches or, So this is the major muscle, right? And then you have a tiny muscle here. You can see it's the pyramidalis, right? Origin for both of them is pubic crust, right? And insertion of the rectus abdominis is in your xiphoid process on top and the costal cartilages. The innervation is thoraco-abdominal nerves, and for pyramidalis is subcostal nerves. Now, pyramidalis, as you can see, they insert into your linea alba, right? Linea alba is basically when all three flat muscles, aponeuroses, fuse. Like that particular part is called linea alba, and your pyramidalis inserts into your linea alba. So when this muscle contracts, it basically tenses your linea alba. Now, rectus abdominis, when that contracts, it compresses your abdominal space, abdominal viscera. It also stabilizes your pelvis well. Now, three muscles that we'll talk about in the posterior abdominal wall. You have quadratus femoris, psoas major, and psoas minor. You can see the origin, insertion, and innervation here. Innervation, all three muscles are by the anterior branch of the spinal nerves. When you study the cross-section of your spinal cord, you'll study about the anterior branch and all of that. Right, so your anterior branch of your spinal nerves innervate all three muscles. The level is different, as you can see, I've already written here. The first muscle, quadratus lumborum. Quadratus femoris. It's not here. I'll attach a picture. Quadratus femoris, it starts from your iliac crust, right? And it inserts into your transverse processes of your L1 to L4 vertebral bodies, right? And the major function of these muscles is the flexion of your vertebral column, all these posterior abdominal wall muscles, right? The psoas major also involves itself in flexion of your thigh. Now you can see like all the muscles here, and yeah, that's all you talk about. There are two parts of your abdomen that you talk about: anterior, anterolateral, posterior muscles of and the fascias of each. And that's it for this. Thank you.